We haven't received any additional information from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement with regard to the functionality of the weapon. We can confirm that it is a replica. It is made to look almost identical to both the military and the civilian style of AR-15 or M16 rifle, very similar to what we carry as law enforcement. It did not have the orange plastic tip that is required by federal law to discern it from a real weapon. And because of the low lighting conditions and the distance that our officers and deputies were, it was very, very difficult to discern whether or not it was a real firearm or a replica firearm. I don't have any other information as to the functionality of the item itself, whether it was a BB gun or an airsoft gun, pellet gun, whatever the case may be. As soon as we get that information from FDLE and we're able to release that, we will.
Normal guns are dangerous, but how what kind of emphasis do these imitation weapons pose to the community, law enforcement in general?
Sure. We train to assume that every weapon that we are encountered with is real. When we expect an individual that we come in contact with that is armed to comply with deputies and officers' directions to step away from the weapon and de-arm themselves. So we have to go under the assumption, not knowing the individual based on the information we have at the time, that all the weapons we are presented with are real. There's plenty of documentation throughout the law enforcement community that we share with each other as far as intelligence is concerned, and we have multiple examples of weapons that are disguised to look like toys that are actually functioning firearms. That's why we train and we go under the assumption, even in our training scenarios, that every weapon is loaded and every weapon is real.
What's department policy when it comes to situations like these when you had nine LEOs involved in this? Why not have one? Was there just a command to take lethal force if he did not comply?
No.
And is that why we saw so many rounds go off?
No, and that'll be explained tonight in the community meeting. You have to understand that multiple officers and multiple agencies responded to this situation. Deputies and officers did not drive into the complex. They parked at the entrance to the complex and they approached on foot looking for the individual with the weapon. There were multiple officers there. That is standard procedure, especially when you have a lethal force scenario or a time where an individual is armed with a weapon. So it's not uncommon to have that much of a law enforcement response for an armed disturbance. Deputies and officers were paired up in separate teams, and you'll see, based on the information that will be given out today, that deputies and officers were in different areas of the Majestic Oaks complex at the time that the decision was made to utilize lethal force. It was very clear from the commanders that were on scene, the supervisors that were on scene, that the primary responsibility would be the safety of the individual who was who threatened to commit suicide first, and then when that individual rearmed himself, our focus turned directly to the safety of the residents that were sleeping or in their apartments at that time. We had the information that the weapon was real. We had no reason to believe that it wasn't, and so we have to take that threat seriously, and we responded accordingly. Crisis intervention training is a 40-hour curriculum that's put on for law enforcement officers and civilian employees of law enforcement that trains us how to recognize individuals in mental crisis, those that are currently going in crisis mode, those that have mental illnesses, and how to operate in de-escalation techniques. We did have 4 law enforcement officers between the Gainesville Police Department and the Alachua County Sheriff's Office that were trained in crisis intervention, and the techniques that we learned in that class were employed by the individuals that were communicating with Mr. Dentmond. Again, at some point those communications failed or deteriorated, at which point Mr. Dentmond rearmed himself, and we all know how the incident concluded.